People make judgments about other people in the first 30 seconds. I have known this my entire life. I have known it the way a man knows which way the wind is blowing before he opens the door. Not because he checked a forecast, but because he spent 63 years paying attention. You learn to read rooms. You learn to read faces. And you learn, eventually, that the most dangerous person in any room is almost never the loudest one. My name is Walter Greer. I am 63 years old. I drive a 1997 Chevrolet pickup that has 211,000 miles on the odometer, a crack in the passenger side mirror that I have been meaning to fix since 2019, and a faint smell of motor oil that no amount of Pine air fresheners has ever fully defeated. I wear the same 5 flannel shirts on rotation. I take my coffee black, no sugar, in a white ceramic mug that my late wife Margaret bought at a roadside antique market in 1989 for $1.50, and which I have used every single morning since the day she died. I live in the same house I have lived in for 31 years, on a street where the oak trees are older than most of the marriages in the neighborhood. My neighbor Dottie Carmichael once told me I was the most unassuming wealthy man she had ever met. I told her I wasn't wealthy. She laughed. I laughed too. We talked for 20 minutes about her rose bushes, and I went home. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer before I retired. Before that, I spent 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, 2 of them overseas. I do not bring this up at parties, because I do not go to parties. I do not bring it up at dinners, because I eat most of my dinners alone at the kitchen table, with a book and the radio on low. I have built bridges, designed load-bearing systems for buildings in 4 states, and consulted on 2 major infrastructure projects that most people in this country have driven across or through without ever knowing my name was attached to them. This does not bother me. In structural engineering, if everything goes right, no one notices your work. That is the whole point. A bridge that nobody comments on is a bridge that is doing exactly what it was built to do. My daughter Claire is 31 years old, and she is the best thing I have ever built. She got her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh, and apparently, her father's taste for difficult men. I say that not as an insult. I say it as a man who spent 34 years solving problems that looked unsolvable, and who recognizes the same stubborn love of a challenge when he sees it in his own daughter's face. She met Daniel Holt at a conference in Chicago 2 years ago. He was presenting on corporate finance strategy. She was there representing the architecture firm she works for. She called me that Sunday evening and said, "Dad, I met someone who talks like he invented money." I told her that was not necessarily a bad thing. She said, "He also has very good shoes." I told her that was also not necessarily a bad thing. She laughed. That laugh. Margaret's laugh. And I knew before she said another word that this one was going to be around for a while. Daniel Holt was 34, a senior partner at a financial consulting firm in Atlanta. The kind of man who wears his confidence the way other men wear cologne. You notice it immediately. It fills the room, and after a while, you start to wonder whether it's covering something up. He drove a silver Mercedes. He had a firm handshake and a direct gaze, and a laugh that was always just slightly too fast. The way a laugh is when someone is performing rather than genuinely amused. I noticed these things the first time I met him, at a dinner Claire arranged at her apartment in Atlanta about 6 months into their relationship. I noticed them the way an engineer notices a hairline crack in a foundation. Not with alarm, not yet, just with a mental note. File that away. Watch how it develops. That dinner went fine. He was charming and attentive and asked good questions about Claire's work and competent questions about mine. When Claire told him I was a retired engineer, he said, "That's great, that's honest work," with a particular brand of warmth that men use when they want to sound sincere and can't quite manage it. I thanked him. I told him about the bridge project. He nodded and said something about infrastructure being undervalued in the public conversation. I agreed with him because he was right. I did not mention the second project. There was no reason to mention it yet.
An engineer does not reveal the load capacity of a structure to the first person who taps the wall. We shook hands at the end of the evening, and he said, "Claire talks about you a lot. I can see where she gets it." I thanked him again and drove home in my truck, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes after I turned off the engine, the way I do sometimes, just listening to the metal cool. I thought about what he hadn't said as much as what he had. I filed the hairline crack away, watched how it developed. The problem, when it arrived, did not come from Daniel Holt. It came from his father. Richard Holt was 68 years old, a retired insurance executive from Buckhead, which is the part of Atlanta where people build houses specifically so that the houses can be seen from the road. He had made a considerable amount of money over his career, most of it through other people's misfortune, which is more or less what insurance companies do. And he had spent a considerable amount of that money making sure that everyone who came within his orbit understood that he had made it. He drove a black Cadillac Escalade. He wore his watch on the outside of his shirt cuff. He had a handshake that lasted approximately 1 second longer than necessary, as though the extra second was there to remind you who had the stronger grip. I met him at a Sunday lunch that Daniel's mother arranged, about 8 months after Claire and Daniel started dating. The house was large and aggressively decorated, the kind of home where every object has been selected to communicate something about the owner's taste, which is to say that no object in it was actually just an object. There was a painting in the foyer that I recognized as the work of a moderately well-known regional artist, whose work sold for significant sums at charity auctions. There was a bar cart in the sitting room with whiskeys that Daniel named when he poured them, because he understood that naming them was the point. There were fresh flowers on the table, and good linen, and a housekeeper who appeared and disappeared with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a long time. I wore my good flannel shirt, which is to say, the dark blue one without the faded elbow. I drove my truck, which I parked on the street rather than in the driveway, not because I was embarrassed by it, but because I had arrived 5 minutes early, and I did not want to block anyone. I brought a bottle of wine that my friend Gerald Bauer, who knows more about wine than any person I have ever met, had chosen for me, and said was excellent. I also brought a small potted rosemary plant, because Claire had told me Daniel's mother liked to cook, and I find that herbs are a more useful gift than flowers, which die. Daniel's mother, Patricia, met me at the door and was genuinely warm in the way that only people who are actually warm can be. Not performed, not calculated, just real. She took the rosemary and held it in both hands and said, "Oh, this is wonderful. I'll use this for months." And I believed her. She had kind eyes, and the particular kind of ease that comes from having spent a lifetime caring for other people without needing credit for it. I liked her immediately. I have learned to trust that feeling. Richard Holt came out of the sitting room with his whiskey already in hand, which told me something, and extended the extra second handshake, which told me something else. He looked me up and down in the way that men who have made their money late in life look at men who they believe have not made any. It was a quick look, almost imperceptible, but I have been an engineer for 34 years. I notice load-bearing things. "Walter," he said, "Danny's told me a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," I said, "because that is what you say." "Of course," he said, with a smile that lasted exactly as long as the handshake. "Come on in. We'll get you something to drink." The afternoon proceeded the way those afternoons do, when one person in the room has decided, before it began, what every other person in the room is. Richard Holt spoke about his career with the thoroughness of a man who has confused net worth with biography. He referenced people by name with the expectation that those names would be recognized. A state senator, a developer whose buildings I had, in fact, driven past on the interstate, a television personality from a home improvement show. He talked about the market and Daniel's firm and a property in the mountains that they were in the process of acquiring.
He asked me about retirement in the way men ask about retirement when they want to confirm their theory that the person across from them has nothing of consequence to do. "So you're enjoying the slower pace?" he said. I told him I stayed fairly busy. "With what?" he said. And there was something in the way he said it. Not hostile, not exactly. Just gently curious in the way a man is gently curious when he already believes the answer is going to confirm what he thinks. I told him I had some consulting work. I told him I had a project I was advising on. Nothing major, mostly technical review work. I told him I kept a garden in the backyard that had gotten somewhat out of hand, and that I was losing a long-running argument with a particular stand of black-eyed Susans about who owned the fence line. He laughed at the garden. The laugh was genuine. He had a story about a gardener he'd hired once, who'd replanted his wife's entire flower bed without being asked. And we talked about that for a while. And for those few minutes, I liked him. Because people are almost always more than what they perform, if you wait long enough for the performance to slip. But it slipped back, and by the end of the afternoon, I understood what Richard Holtz thought of me. He thought I was a nice enough old fellow in a flannel shirt, who had worked a modest career in a practical field, and who was now retired on a modest income in a house in a modest neighborhood, and who had raised a good daughter. Credit to me for that, he made that clear. He was generous with the credit. But who was, in the fundamental way that men like Richard Holt measure such things, not quite the right kind of person for his son to be building a future with. He didn't say any of this. He didn't have to. It was in the rhythm of the conversation, the questions he asked and the ones he skipped, the way he turned to Daniel when he wanted to say something that mattered, and turned to me when he wanted to say something polite. I drove home in my truck that evening and parked in the driveway and sat there for a while with the engine off. The oak tree at the end of the drive had turned in the past week, and the leaves were coming down in the particular slow way they come down when there's almost no wind. I thought about the lunch. I thought about the handshake and the look and the questions. I thought about an engineering principle I had taught to a dozen younger colleagues over the years. The most dangerous load on any structure is not the one you can see. It is the one that has been accumulating quietly in a place no one thought to inspect. I went inside and made coffee in Margaret's mug, and sat at the kitchen table with a book I wasn't really reading, and I thought about how things develop, how cracks develop. I had filed one away 8 months ago at Claire's dinner table. Now I had a new one to add to the file. I did not call Claire that night. There was nothing to say yet. I have learned, over 63 years, that the moment to speak is not always the moment you have something to say. Sometimes you wait. Sometimes you let the structure settle, and you see which cracks widen and which ones hold. If you've been listening to these stories for a while, and if they mean something to you, do one small thing right now. Subscribe. It costs you nothing. For us, it matters enormously. Hit the like button while you listen, and drop a comment below telling me what you think. You'll want to stay. And now, we continue. 4 months after that Sunday lunch, Daniel Holt asked my daughter to marry him, in a restaurant in Atlanta, with a ring that Claire called me about at 11:30 at night, whispering into the phone from the restaurant bathroom because she was too happy to speak at normal volume without crying. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, still wearing my reading glasses, and I listened to her be happy in her mother's voice. And I thought, good. Whatever comes next, good. What came next was a meeting. Richard Holt called me 3 weeks after the engagement. He had gotten my number from Daniel, he said. He said he wanted to discuss some things. He said he thought it would be good for the two of us to sit down, man to man, and talk through the situation. I told him I was available the following Saturday morning. He said he'd prefer to come to me, if that was all right, because he had a few things to show me and didn't want to carry them far. I told him Saturday morning was fine and gave him my address. He arrived at 9 o'clock in the black Escalade, wearing weekend clothes that had probably cost more than my kitchen appliances, and he walked up the path to my front door with the look of a man performing a goodwill visit to a neighborhood that wasn't quite up to his standards, but where he intended to be gracious about it. I met him at the door with coffee. He took the mug with a thank you and looked around my kitchen and living room with a specific kind of measured approval that is worse than disapproval, because it communicates, without saying so, that the person doing the approving expected less and is pleased to have found slightly more. We sat at the kitchen table. He put a folder on it. I said nothing. An engineer knows not to touch a load-bearing element before he understands what it is bearing. He said he wanted to be direct with me, Walter, man to man, father to father. He said he loved his son and wanted the best for him. He said he thought Claire was a wonderful girl. Genuinely, he said, genuinely wonderful, and I should be proud because I clearly raised her right. He said all of this with complete apparent sincerity, and I believe he meant it, in the limited way that men mean things, when what they mean is wrapped in what they want. Then he opened the folder. It was a prenuptial agreement, a thorough one, several pages, with provisions that had clearly been drafted by someone who knew what they were doing. He slid it across the table toward me and said he hoped I would understand. It was just good practice, with the difference in their financial situations. Nothing personal, just prudent planning. He said Daniel had agreed it was the right thing. He said Claire might have some resistance, which was understandable, completely understandable, and he thought it would help if her father was on board. I looked at the document. I turned the pages slowly, the way I look at structural plans, not searching for what I expect to find, but making sure I see what is actually there. Richard Holt watched me turn the pages with the expression of a man who expects confirmation and is waiting patiently for it. I set the document down. I picked up my coffee. I said, "Richard, can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." I said, "What do you think the difference in their financial situations is?" He paused. He turned his mug in his hands. He said, "Well, Daniel has built a very strong position at the firm, as you know, and his assets." I said, "That's Daniel's situation. I'm asking what you understand Claire's situation to be." He looked at me. He said, "Well, she has a good career at the architecture firm." I said, "She does." He said, "And I'm sure you've been supportive, as much as you're able." There it was. As much as you're able. That was the load-bearing phrase. That was what the folder was really resting on. He had looked at the truck and the flannel and the kitchen table and the modest house on the street with the old oak trees, and he had done his math. And the math had told him something specific about what I was and wasn't able to do. I set down my coffee. I said, "I appreciate you driving out here, Richard, and I appreciate you being direct. I'm going to be direct back. I'm not going to advise Claire to sign that document, but I'd like you to give her the option to consider it herself, because she's 31 years old and she's capable of making her own decisions. Beyond that, I think we can probably agree that a prenuptial agreement is a conversation for Daniel and Claire, not their fathers." His jaw tightened slightly. He said, "I'm just trying to protect my son." I said, "I know. I understand the instinct." He said, "You have to understand, Walter. This isn't about Claire's character. She's a wonderful girl. It's about practicality. Daniel has worked very hard to build what he's built, and," I said, "he has. And I'm proud of him for it. I meant that. I have always found Daniel's ambition genuinely admirable, whatever I think about his father." Richard Holt looked at me for a moment. He looked at the mug in my hands, and the kitchen around us, and the coat hanging on the peg by the back door. And he said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said it not unkindly, which is perhaps why it landed the way it did. He said, "Walter, I'm sure you've done your best, but there's a certain reality here. Our families come from different places. I don't think you disagree with that." I said I wouldn't. He nodded. He said, "I just think it's important that Daniel is protected, given where he is and well, given the situation. Given where he is and where—" and then he stopped. But I heard the rest of the sentence. Everyone in that kitchen heard it, even though only the two of us were there.
I looked at him. I said, "Richard, I appreciate you coming. I'll think about what you've said." He seemed relieved. He stood up and said he hoped we understood each other, and I said I thought we did. He shook my hand, the extra second again, but less certain this time, and he walked out to the Escalade and drove away. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the truck go around the corner, and I thought about what an engineer thinks about when a structure fails to account for a load it doesn't know is there. I thought about what happens to a calculation when the fundamental assumption at its center is wrong. I let it sit for 4 days. I have learned that decisions made in the first 4 days after something like that are decisions made from the wrong part of you. After 4 days, the sharp edge of the thing has dulled enough that you can pick it up and look at it clearly. After 4 days, I picked up the phone and called Gerald Bauer, who is not only the finest judge of wine I know, but also a man who spent 22 years as a corporate attorney before he got tired of corporate attorneys and retired to grow grapes in North Carolina and read books about history. He has been my friend since we were both 28 years old and working on a project in Memphis that neither of us were quite experienced enough for, but that we got through anyway. And he is the person I call when I need to think something through with someone whose judgment I trust completely. I told him what had happened. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. The particular Gerald Bauer quiet that means he is examining the situation from multiple angles simultaneously, the way a geologist examines a rock face. Then he said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking I should make a phone call." He said, "To whom?" I told him. There was another quiet. Then Gerald said, "You haven't told Claire any of this, have you?" It wasn't a question. He knows how I operate. I said no. I said I wasn't going to tell Claire until I knew what there was to tell. Gerald said, "All right, make the call. And then come visit. I'll open something good." I made the call the following morning. The man I called was Marcus Webb, who runs a private equity firm in Charlotte, and who I have known for 11 years, since he hired my company to consult on the structural engineering review for a commercial development project he was financing. We have had dinner perhaps 15 times over those 11 years. He is not a close friend. He is something more specific than that, which is a man who respects my judgment and whom I respect in return, and who operates in a world that I have had more connection to than most people who see me in my kitchen with my white mug would expect. Marcus picked up on the second ring and said, "Walter, it's been a while."
I told him it had been. I asked him if he had about an hour. He said he had 2, if I needed them. I told him what was happening with Claire and Daniel Holt. I told him about the lunch and the assessment Richard had made of me, and the folder on the kitchen table, and the phrase that had been left unfinished. Marcus listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always respected about him. He does not perform listening. He actually does it. When I finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know Richard Holt. Not well. Enough. I'll make some calls." I thanked him. He said, "Walter, I have to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Does Claire know about the Meridian Bridge project?" I said, "No." He said, "Does she know about the Portland contracts?" I said, "No." He said, "Does she know about any of it?" I said, "She knows I was an engineer. She knows I'm retired.
She knows I have enough to take care of myself. I never thought it was important for her to know more than that. Marcus was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "All right, I'll make the calls. Give me a few days." I went to the kitchen and made coffee in Margaret's mug, and stood at the counter and thought about what I had not told my daughter, and why. I have thought about this question a lot over the years, and I have always come back to the same answer. Margaret and I raised Claire to understand that the value of a person is not in what they have accumulated, but in what they are, in the quality of their work, and the reliability of their character, and the depth of their care for the people around them. We raised her in that house with those oak trees and those 5 flannel shirts, because we wanted her to grow up understanding that comfort is not the same as worth, and that the people who have the most to say about who they are usually the people who need to say it loudest. I did not want Claire to grow up with a number attached to her father. I wanted her to grow up with a father. There is a difference, and I have always believed it was worth protecting. But standing in that kitchen 4 days after Richard Holt had sat across from me and explained my situation to me, I thought about the unfinished sentence. Given where he is and where... I thought about the folder. I thought about what Richard Holt would do with the next 6 months, and the 6 months after that, and what the years of a marriage look like when one side of it spends those years managing a quiet, confident contempt for where the other side came from. An engineer knows that a structure does not fail all at once. It fails by accumulation. Small stresses, repeated over time, in a place no one thought to inspect. You do not address a structural problem by waiting for the catastrophic failure. You address it when you first identify the crack. I let Marcus work for 5 days. On the 6th day, he called me back. He said, "I've got what you need. When do you want to use it?" I said I'd let him know. I needed to talk to Claire first. I drove to Atlanta on a Thursday evening. Claire was home and surprised to see me. I had not called ahead, which I do not usually do, and she looked at my face when she opened the door and read something there that made her step back and say, "Dad, what's wrong?" I told her nothing was wrong. I told her I needed to tell her some things, and I had a couple of hours if she had a couple of hours. She said of course, and she went and made tea, and I sat at her kitchen table and waited. She sat across from me with her mug in both hands, the way her mother used to hold a mug, and she waited with her mother's patience. I told her about Richard Holt coming to the house. I told her about the folder. I told her what he had said, as accurately as I could, including the unfinished sentence. I watched her face as I spoke. She is her mother's daughter. She does not show things quickly, and when she shows them, they are real. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He came to our house." I said he had. She said, "He brought a prenup to our house to talk to you about it, without telling me." I said yes. She set down her mug. She said, "And Daniel knew he was going to do this?" I said I didn't know what Daniel knew. I said that was worth asking. She was quiet again. I could see her doing what I do, examining the thing from multiple angles before she responds to it, checking the load-bearing parts. She is, genuinely, my daughter. Then she said, "Dad, what did he mean by where you are and where?" I said, "He meant he thinks your family comes from a different financial reality than his. He meant he's concerned about protecting Daniel's assets. And he meant that my truck and my kitchen table and my flannel shirts told him a story about what kind of family you're coming from. And he believed that story." Claire looked at me. She said, "Is the story true?" I said, "Parts of it." She said, "What parts aren't?" I took a breath. I thought about Margaret, who had known the whole of it and had agreed with me, entirely and without reservation, that it was not a number Claire needed. I thought about what 31 years of raising this woman had looked like, and what I hoped it had taught her. I thought about the unfinished sentence.
I said, "Claire, I need to tell you some things about your father." I told her about the Meridian Bridge project, which is a cable-stayed bridge in the Pacific Northwest that opened in 2008 and which won 2 engineering awards, and which I retain a royalty interest in through a licensing agreement that has paid me a reliable income for 17 years. I told her about the Portland commercial contracts, which are 3 long-term structural consulting agreements with development companies that I negotiated before I retired, and which continued to generate revenue through the firm I technically still own a 60% stake in, with the remaining 40% held by the 2 younger engineers I brought on as partners in 2015. I told her about the investment accounts, which Gerald's brother-in-law has managed for 20 years, with a kind of steady, unsexy competence that does not produce dramatic stories, but does produce results. I told her about the trust I had established in her name 8 years ago, which I had never mentioned because there was nothing to mention yet. It would transfer to her at a time of my choosing, and I had not chosen yet. I told her the number, the approximate number, because there are always variables, but close enough. Claire was very still. She had stopped holding her mug.
She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was about 7 years old, and discovered that the Santa Claus at the mall was wearing a fake beard. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" And then she stopped. I said, "Because I wanted you to grow up with a father, not a balance sheet." She was quiet for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went past on the street. Then she said, "Does any of this change what Richard Holt said to you?" I said, "It changes what he can say going forward, if he knows." She said, "And if he doesn't?" I said, "Then the unfinished sentence keeps getting finished in his head, and it keeps finding its way into your marriage, and into the way he talks to Daniel about your family, and into every holiday dinner and every decision where he thinks his opinion carries more weight than it should. Cracks don't resolve themselves, Claire. They accumulate." She sat with that for a minute.
Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Whatever you think is right. This is your marriage. I'm not asking for anything from Richard Holt. But I think you should have complete information before you decide how to proceed." She nodded slowly. She said, "Is there a meeting I should be at?" I said I thought there might be one, yes. She said, "When?" I said, "Whenever you say." She picked up her mug. She held it in both hands, looking at the table. Then she said, "Next Saturday. Daniel and his parents are coming for dinner at our place." She looked up at me. "Come early." I told her I would. I drove home that night in the truck, and the highway was dark and mostly empty, and I had the radio on low, the late-night station that plays old country music, which is the only kind of music that seems designed for long drives in the dark.
I thought about Margaret, who I have thought about every day for 9 years, and who I miss with a steadiness that has become, over time, something close to companionship. I thought about what she would have said about all of this. I thought she probably would have said something practical and slightly wry, and completely correct, as she almost always did. I thought she would have approved of the dinner on Saturday. I got home at 10:30 and parked in the driveway, and sat for a moment in the dark with the engine off, listening to the oak tree and the quiet, and the occasional distant sound of a car on the main road. I went inside and made coffee I didn't need in the mug I always use, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I opened the notebook I keep by the stove, a plain composition notebook that I have used for years to keep lists and notes and occasional calculations. And I wrote out, slowly and in order, every fact I intended to bring to Saturday's dinner. I did it the way I used to do load calculations, methodically, completely, without omitting anything that bore weight. When I was done, I closed the notebook and drank my coffee, which had gone somewhat cold, and I sat in the kitchen in the quiet house that I have lived in for 31 years, and I thought about what Saturday would look like. Not with satisfaction, not with anticipation, with the specific, settled clarity of an engineer who has examined a structure, identified the failing element, and knows exactly what needs to happen next. I called Marcus Webb at 8 o'clock the next morning and told him to send me everything he had. He said it would be in my email within the hour. He said, "You need anything else from me, Walter?" I told him I thought I had what I needed. He said, "You know, I've known Richard Holt for about 7 years. Not well, like I said, but well enough to know he's the kind of man who has a very clear picture of how things are arranged." He paused.
I look forward to hearing how Saturday goes. I said I'd let him know. He said, Walter. And then he said, You never change, do you? I said I didn't see the point. He laughed. He said to say hello to Gerald, and we hung up. Saturday arrived the way late autumn Saturdays arrive in Georgia. Cool and dry, with a particular quality of light that makes everything look both sharp and slightly distant, as though the world has been cleaned and set back carefully in its place. I drove to Claire's apartment at 2 in the afternoon, 4 hours before the dinner. I brought the notebook. I brought the folder Marcus had sent, which I had printed out at the library because my printer has not worked correctly since 2021, and I have not bothered to fix it. I brought a bottle of wine that Gerald had selected, which he had told me was excellent, and which I suspected was his idea of a small architectural joke. Something that looked modest on the label and would be unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Claire met me at the door. She looked steady, in the way she looks steady when she is carrying something heavy and has decided to carry it correctly. We sat at her kitchen table, and I spread out the relevant documents and went through them with her, calmly and in order. She asked good questions. She is her mother's daughter and her father's daughter, which means she does not flinch at information, even when the information is complicated. By the time Daniel arrived at 5:30, we had been through everything. He came in carrying a bag of groceries for dinner and stopped when he saw me at the table, surprised, and then looked at Claire. She met his eyes. I watched him try to read her face and not quite succeed. He said, Walter, I didn't know you were coming early. I said Claire had asked me to. He set down the bag. He looked at the papers on the table and back at Claire. He said, quietly, What is this? Claire said, Sit down, Daniel. He sat. She told him, quietly and clearly, what I had told her. About his father coming to my house, about the folder, about the conversation, and about the thing that his father had said and then not quite finished saying. She told him without anger and without dramatics, the way you tell someone something that needs to be understood. Daniel listened. His jaw tightened about halfway through. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I knew he was going to talk to you. I told him it was a bad idea. I said, What did he say to that? Daniel looked at me. He said he was just trying to look out for me. He paused. He talks about Claire's family sometimes. He has this... He stopped. He pressed his lips together. He said, he has this way of talking about it, like it's just a fact about the situation, like it's just realistic. I said, What does he say? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, He says you seem like a decent man. He says Claire's well raised. He looked at the table. He says that sometimes you can tell when someone's had a solid, modest life, and there's no shame in it. Claire said nothing. I said nothing. We let it sit there in the room the way an engineer lets a load sit on a test structure, to see where the stress goes. Then Daniel said, I'm sorry, I should have told him to stay out of it. I said, You have time to correct that. He looked up. He said, What do you mean? I said, His parents are coming tonight. So am I. And there are some things I think it would be useful for your father to understand about this family, before he finishes some of the sentences he's been leaving incomplete. I paused. If that's all right with you. Daniel looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Claire. She met his eyes. He said, Yeah, okay. I said, Thank you. And I meant it. Richard and Patricia Holt arrived at 7:15 in the Escalade. Patricia came in first and hugged Claire and complimented the apartment and gave me a warm smile that was entirely genuine and that I returned. Richard came in behind her, and he did not stop when he saw me. He recovered too quickly for a stop. It was more of a fractional pause, something in his posture that adjusted itself so rapidly it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. And he said, Walter, good to see you. I didn't know you were joining us tonight. With a particular brand of warmth that is not quite warm enough to be warm, but is certainly not cold enough to be cold. I said I was glad Claire had thought to include me. We had dinner. It was a good dinner. Claire cooks well, as her mother did, and the conversation moved through the normal channels. Daniel's work, the engagement timeline, where they were thinking about the ceremony. Patricia was warm and engaged, and asked questions that showed she was actually listening to the answers. Richard was polished and sociable, and revealed his priorities in the usual ways. The references to Daniel's success, the gentle steering of topics back toward the future Richard could see from where he was standing. After dinner, Daniel cleared the dishes and Claire made coffee, and we sat in the living room. And then Richard Holt looked at me from across the coffee table, pleasantly, and said, So, Walter, how are things? Staying busy in retirement? I looked at him. I said, I am, actually. I had an interesting week. He said, Oh? I said, I had a conference call with the two partners at my firm.
We're doing a structural review for a project down near Savannah. Large mixed-use development, about 18 months out. Some interesting load-bearing challenges on the coastal site. I find I still enjoy that kind of problem. Richard looked at me with the beginning of something. Not quite understanding yet, but a readjustment starting at the edges. He said, Your firm? I said, I retain a 60% stake. I stepped back from active management in 2018, but I stay involved with the technical review work, which is what I was always best at anyway. A pause. He said, I didn't realize you still had a firm. I said, Most people don't. I'm not much for talking about work at social occasions. I held his gaze for a moment, steady. I find it rarely tells you what's actually important about a person. He looked at me. I watched the adjustment continue. Patricia was looking at her husband with an expression that suggested she was watching a scene she had half expected and was curious how it would conclude. Daniel reached over to the side table and picked up the folder, the second folder, the one I had brought in from the car before dinner and left there for exactly this moment, and set it on the coffee table. He said, Dad, there are some things Claire and I thought you should know. Richard looked at the folder. He looked at Daniel. He looked at me. And for the first time since I had met Richard Holt, I watched him look at me without the measurement in his eyes, without the quick inventory of the truck and the shirt and the house on the modest street, because the folder was sitting on the coffee table between us, and he hadn't opened it yet, but he could already feel the weight of it shifting. Daniel pushed the folder toward his father. Richard opened it. He turned the first page. He turned the second page. I watched his face do what faces do when the fundamental assumption at the center of a calculation turns out to be wrong. The slow, careful dismantling of a certainty that had been load-bearing. He turned the third page. He set the folder down. He said quietly, Walter. I said, Richard? He said, I didn't. I said, No, you didn't. He looked at the folder and then at me, and then at Claire, who was sitting very straight and very still in the chair beside the couch,
watching her future father-in-law, the way you watch a demonstration of something that has been explained to you theoretically. Richard said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "I appreciate that, but I think there's someone else you owe one to first." He looked at Claire. She looked back at him. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator made a sound and then stopped. Richard Holt. And I want to be precise here because I think it matters. Richard Holt did not look like a man who was performing humility. He looked like a man who was genuinely encountering a version of himself that he had not expected to meet. He said, "Claire." He said, "I'm sorry, the way I made some assumptions about your family that I shouldn't have, that weren't—" He stopped. He started again. "They weren't fair, and I'm sorry." Claire said, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words, even and clear. And she meant both of them, and no more. Patricia reached across and put her hand on her husband's arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I stood up after a moment and said I was going to help Daniel with the dishes. Daniel said I didn't have to, and I said I wanted to. And we went into the kitchen and washed dishes and talked about the Savannah Project and the load-bearing challenges on a coastal site, and whether composite materials had gotten to the point where they made sense for certain structural applications. And it was the best conversation I had had with Daniel Holt in the 2 years I had known him. He is, when the performance is off, a genuinely intelligent man, with a genuine interest in how things are built. I found I liked him. As I was putting on my coat to leave, Richard Holt came into the hallway. He looked at me. He said, "I called it a modest life. I was wrong about that." I said, "You weren't entirely wrong. The life is modest. That part is accurate." I pulled on the coat. "That's by design, Richard. I find modest lives tend to hold together better under stress than impressive ones." I picked up my notebook from the side table. Impressive lives are built for appearances.
They hold up fine when nothing heavy is resting on them. He looked at me. He said, "That's fair." I said, "Good night, Richard. Thank you for coming." I shook his hand. "1 second, not 2. He said, "Good night, Walter." I hugged Claire at the door. She held on for a moment longer than usual, and I felt her breath against my shoulder and thought of the small person she had been and the woman she had become. And I thought that Margaret would have been glad to see all of this, and sad to have missed it, and that she would have said something practical and slightly wry and completely correct about both things at once. I drove home in the truck. The highway was quiet. The radio played something by Merle Haggard. I had the window down a few inches because the night air was good and cold and the right kind of clean. And I thought about an engineering principle I learned early in my career, one of those fundamental things that takes years to understand fully. A structure that has been correctly built does not need to announce itself. It simply holds. Through all the weights placed on it, through all the seasons, through all the changes in the loads it carries, it simply holds. 8 months later, Claire and Daniel got married on a Saturday afternoon in October, in a small ceremony in the garden of a friend's farmhouse outside of Atlanta, with the trees in color and the light, that specific deep gold that October light gets in the South. And my daughter walked toward the man she had chosen in a dress she had designed herself, which is what architects do when they love something enough. They make it. I sat in the front row, in a blue flannel shirt, the good one, and I watched her come down the aisle, and I thought about her mother, and I thought about what it means to build something that lasts. Richard Holt sat 2 seats from me. He had driven a regular car, a blue Subaru he said his wife preferred for long drives. He was wearing a jacket without a tie. His watch was inside his cuff. During the reception, he found me near the dessert table and said, "Walter." I said, "Richard." He said, "I owe you. I think I owe you more of an apology than I gave you."
I said I thought we were even. He said, I had a very specific picture of who you were, from the outside. He said, I'm sorry I let that run ahead of me. I said I appreciated it. He said, I'd like to hear more about the Savannah Project sometime, if you're willing to talk shop. I said I was usually willing to talk shop. He said good, and we shook hands, and it was 1 second, like everyone else's. I sat with Claire for a few minutes late in the evening, after the dancing had moved back inside and the garden had gone quiet. She had her shoes off and was sitting on the stone steps with a glass of champagne and her hair starting to come loose. And she looked so much like her mother in that moment that my heart did the thing it does. The particular ache of someone who was here and is gone and is still somehow present. Claire said, Dad? I said, yeah. She said, why didn't you tell me about all of it? I said I had already told her. She said, I mean before, years ago. I thought about it. I said, because the important thing about you was never going to be what you came from, and I didn't want you to think it was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, was that for me or for you? I thought about that too. I said, both, probably. She nodded.
She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small, and we sat in the dark garden with the light strung in the trees and the music coming from inside. And I thought about what it means to have built something that lasts. I drove home after midnight in the truck, which started on the first try as it always does, because I maintain it correctly, which is all anything really requires. I drove the dark highway with the window down and the radio off, and I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment and looked at the oak tree, which had dropped most of its leaves and stood in the dark the way oak trees stand, solid and patient and not particularly interested in being noticed. I went inside and made coffee in Margaret's mug, even though it was past midnight and I didn't need the caffeine, because some habits are not about need. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of me. I opened it to the last page I had written on, the page where I had laid out, methodically and completely, every fact I intended to bring to that dinner. I read it through once. Then I closed the notebook. Richard Holt had looked at my truck and my kitchen and my flannel shirt and decided he understood the structure he was looking at. He had run his calculation and reached his conclusion, and the conclusion had seemed solid to him, and he had been comfortable resting weight on it. He had not inspected the foundation. An engineer who makes that mistake is an engineer who has been lucky for a long time and has confused luck with understanding. The calculation is not wrong because the number is big. The calculation is wrong because it started from the wrong place. It started from the surface. And structures, in my experience, are almost never about the surface. I sat in the kitchen in the quiet house for a while, and I drank the coffee. And I thought about Margaret. And I thought about Claire in that dress, in that garden, with the October light. And I thought about what 34 years of building things teaches you about what matters and what doesn't. What matters is the foundation, what it's made of, how it was laid, whether the people who built it knew what they were doing and cared enough to do it right. The rest, the surface, the appearance, the things people see from the road, the rest is just finish work. I closed the notebook. I washed the mug and set it on the dish rack the way I always do. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed in the house I have lived in for 31 years, on the street where the oak trees are older than most of the marriages in the neighborhood. And I slept without difficulty, the way a man sleeps when he has done the work correctly and the structure is holding. That is all it ever was. I was not trying to prove something to Richard Holt. I was not interested in his apology as a prize. I was interested in my daughter's marriage having a correct foundation, in the people surrounding it understanding clearly and without ambiguity what was actually there.
I have spent my career making sure structures do not fail because of what was not understood about them. This was the same work, just a different scale. My neighbor Dottie Carmichael knocked on my door about a week after the wedding and asked how it had gone, and I told her it had gone well. She said she'd heard Claire looked beautiful. I said she had. Dottie said, "You must be so proud." I said I was. She said, "You're a good father, Walter. I've always thought that." I thanked her. She went back to her garden, and I went back to mine, and the afternoon was quiet and good, and I thought that was enough. Some men need the last word. I just need the last fact.
And the last fact, in this case, is simple. Richard Holt looked at the outside of something and made a decision. He was wrong. He learned he was wrong. He adjusted, which is the most you can ask of anyone. And I went home in my truck, which has 211,000 miles on it and a crack in the passenger side mirror and smells faintly of motor oil, and which runs correctly every single time. Because I have taken care of it. Because I know how to take care of things. That was all he missed. He missed the maintenance records.